and that sort of thing. Thank you. So we can make sure that we're all in the right place and here for the same workshop today. Welcome everyone. My name is Stephanie Brewer. I am with the Center for Community Engaged Learning at Michigan State University. And like I said, I see some familiar faces, so good to see you all, and I see some new faces, so I'm excited to meet you all. I will be kind of hosting and facilitating today's session. And so if you have any kind of logistical questions, don't hesitate to ask me in the chat. But you are here for this session that is session number 2, actually, in a summer virtual reboot camp, which has been hosted last week and this week by the IARSLCE Special Programming Committee. If you were able to join us last week for the first session, which was focused on mental health and wellness, those of us who are practitioner scholars in this space, you got the opportunity to spend some time connecting with fellow colleagues and doing a little introspection work and mindfulness work, and it was really lovely. And so hopefully those of you who were able to join us for that enjoyed that experience. Do know if you were not able to join us last week, you will still be able to fully participate in this session. So if you are new this week, we welcome you. So this week's session is Nurturing Student Mental Health Through Community Engaged Pedagogy. And so obviously we'll be focusing on the student experience in the community engaged kind of teaching and learning space. And we'll be talking through some and centering some very tangible pedagogical practices that you can hopefully take home to your home campus and to your learning spaces, and have some things that you can kind of think through and implement in this quickly approaching academic year. So that will be our focus. I'll introduce our speakers and kind of talk you through what we're doing here in just a second. Just for some housekeeping for today, as we're talking about mental health and wellness, we want to encourage you to use this space in a way that you are comfortable doing. So if you want your camera on, great. If you want your camera off, great. Please engage with today's content in whatever way makes you the most comfortable and works with your learning style. We will work to get you copies of the slides and links and or copies of any of the resources that we discussed today. So you can even kind of sit back and feel like you don't need to take notes unless that helps you to stay engaged today as well. And then one last housekeeping, if you have questions throughout today's session and our speakers today, please feel free to either jot that down yourself or go ahead and put that question in the chat. If it's something that can be addressed right in the moment, we will see if we can do that, but we will have time at the end to address all of those questions. So if you want to shoot that in the chat so you don't lose it, please feel free to do so, and we will make sure that we get to it. Okay, I'm looking at my little notes. I think that's all our housekeeping. So what I want to do is go ahead and introduce you all to who you will be hearing from today and a little bit about what they will be covering. While I am doing that, we also welcome you to introduce yourselves in the chat as you are comfortable doing. Let us know that you're here, where you're joining us from, your campuses, that sort of thing. So let me move my notes forward. So I'm so excited. I'm so thrilled. I can't wait to learn from all of these speakers today as well. I'm going to do a brief intro and then I will reintroduce them when it is their turn to talk. We are joined today by Dr. Natalie Moser with Michigan State University, and Natalie will be talking about trauma-informed pedagogy. We are also joined by Dr. Estrella Torres, also from Michigan State University, who will be talking through storytelling to develop sense of identity and belonging. And then we're going to kind of close out this session with Dr. Carmine Parati from Providence College and Dr. Jesus Hernandez from Brown University, and they will be talking through supporting student well-being through ungrading. So again, like I said, some really tangible ideas and practices that you can take home with you today. I already said this, I'm going to be facilitating this process, but I am actually going to start us out this afternoon talking about this intersection of student mental health and community engaged teaching and learning, kind of creating some context for why we're even having this conversation today, and attempting to make those connections between student mental health and wellness and our practices of community engaged teaching and learning specifically. So I thought the best way to do this would be to do just a little personal background first, so you all can kind of hear where I'm coming to this space from, the experiences that I have had. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about my research in this area, again, just to provide some of that context to this conversation. So some of you have heard me talk about this before, so hopefully this is still interesting, right? I like to enter these conversations by letting folks know, right, my work in higher education is kind of my second professional life. I started many moons ago my career as a mental health professional. So I was a mental health therapist, and I worked in a lot of different settings for just over a decade. And without all the details, what I found over the course of my work in this area was that I felt increasingly frustrated by what I felt like was my lack of influence in some of these larger systemic issues that my individuals and families that I was working with were working through themselves, right? So I'm working with this person in my office, but there's all these larger systems at play that I just wasn't able to make an impact in. So that kind of frustration or discomfort, or whatever word we want to put on that, is what moved me into the field of higher education and community engagement specifically. And I started working with the Honors College at the University of Alabama. Roll Tide. You have to say that after you say the University of Alabama. It's required by law. And I was responsible for an interdisciplinary minor program down there, where students were focused on community engagement, but within their discipline areas, but doing all of that work together. So super fun work. I loved it. And now I'm here at Michigan State University, as I mentioned earlier, and I kind of support this work where it's happening in academic spaces campus-wide. And so it's really through those contexts, and of course with my lens as a mental health professional prior, that I've watched the student experience working through these community engaged courses, right? So they also, full circle, much like I was, are grappling with these larger systemic issue areas, things like gender inequities and poverty and educational access, right? And they were also showing signs of frustration and disillusionment and all of these kind of things that I too found myself feeling back in the day. So what we know, of course, is that community engaged teaching and learning experiences really push students outside of their emotional comfort zones, right? It pushes them outside of their campus boundaries. And all of these kind of observations in my previous experience led to my interest in pursuing my dissertation research questions in this area. So I'm going to do just a very brief kind of discussion of some of those findings, purely to provide context for, again, why we chose these topic areas for today's workshop. So what I found in my research is probably no surprise to any of you. Mental health and wellness of student populations is a huge issue for higher ed institutions nationally. And also, is probably no surprise, we as institutions are struggling to kind of keep up with demand and to find really best practices for intervening. And what we also have found is that there is absolutely a connection between student mental health and wellness and student success, right? So students who are having challenges in these areas tend to, not always, but tend to also be experiencing lower grades, tend to have less social engagement on campus. They tend to be less likely to seek out services on campus, less persistence to graduation, etc. So But where do community engaged teaching and learning experiences specifically come into play? The literature presents community engaged teaching and learning as kind of this proactive, macro-focused strategy that campuses could use to promote positive mental health and wellness among student populations. Right, so this existing literature speaks to these increased feelings of connection, improved sense of belonging, increased feelings of empowerment and self-efficacy, all as a result of participating in community engaged teaching and learning experiences. And I should clarify more specifically, as a result of participating in the intentional critical reflection that comes with community engaged teaching and learning experiences. The flip side of that, though, the existing scholarship also shows that there are some potential negative mental health and wellness impacts on student participants. Some of those things that I kind of anecdotally referenced, but particularly when community engaged teaching and learning components of the course are not intentional, when they are not guided, and when those reflection experiences don't exist to help our students process and work through the course content. So what my research ended up finding is that students' mental health and wellness are really positively impacted when there is, again, this should probably be no surprise to those of us in the room, when there is intentional critical reflection incorporated into the community engaged learning experience that encourages the examination of three things. So examination of social identity, encourages the development of a sense of belonging, both to campus and to the broader community and to their peers, right? So that we can think about that in a variety of ways. And the third being encourages agency and opportunities for choice on the student's part. So what we've tried to do today with our presenters is to pull together these amazing speakers to talk about these really tangible ways to do those three things, right? So they're going to speak to how they've included this type of pedagogical practice in their own work, the way they've seen it employed in classroom spaces, right? Lots of different examples and ways for you all to think about perhaps applying some of these concepts and ideas to your own campuses. So with that, I am excited to jump in here and introduce our first speaker. So as I said, a little bit of a reintroduction before we pull them on in here. So Dr. Natalie Moser, again with Michigan State University. Natalie is currently the co-director of the Office of Resource Support and Coordination, as well as the director of the Psychological Clinic here on campus. And Natalie is a founding member of our Trauma Services and Training Network, which is a phenomenal resource, and we could talk about that for days. I'm sure Natalie will reference it, but comes to us today with a ton of background and experience in this area to talk broadly, kind of provide that broader context about trauma-informed pedagogy at large. So Natalie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for having me. Okay, so I have been fully introduced, as has my presentation, so we can advance to the next slide. I'm going to give you a really brief overview. We each have 20 minutes to talk, and as I sort of mentioned to my co-presenters, I'm sure all of us could talk about these topic areas for a really long time, so this really will be more of an overview of each of these things. I'm going to start with sort of a trauma 101. What is trauma? What does it look like? Where does it come from? So that we're all on the same page in terms of the ideas and the conceptualizations of trauma. And then sort of provide what, I know many of you are here for, which is strategies for having a trauma-informed classroom. And I'm going to leave you all with resources and additional learning. And it's my understanding that these slides will be sent out. So those are just links for you all to click through when you feel you'd like to. Next slide. Stephanie wonderfully covered this earlier, so I'll just reiterate that the content I know I'll be talking about, and definitely some of the co-presenters can be activating, may be challenging. So just take care of yourself during this time, do whatever it is that you need to do, be mindful of your feelings, take a break if you want. Just consider what you may need to be successful today. And as Stephanie mentioned, learn in the ways that work best for you, which is probably going to be a common theme in what we're talking about in regards to trauma-informed classrooms. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to start with just a definition of trauma. This is the SAMHSA definition. May be familiar to some of you, but trauma is an event, a series of events or circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So this is meant to be as broad as possible to capture the many different types of negative events and outcomes that a person could experience. There are a few animations on this slide, Stephanie, if you kind of go through it and click maybe twice. So we are kind of thinking through some revised or more updated definitions of trauma as we learn and as we present on this to so many different audiences, which I am so pleased to be able to do so that more people understand. But a couple of things here that are important to mention about trauma so that we're coming out of this with hope. I always say I couldn't possibly do what I do if I didn't have hope. And I am an optimistic person. So trauma is one possible response to adversity. What we want to do when we're thinking about traumatic events is we want to think about what do our communities need so that individuals in our community who experience adversity may or may not lead down more negative outcome paths, right? So trauma is just one possible response. It does not mean that everyone who experiences adversity will end up feeling like some of the feelings we talk about today or demonstrating some of the behaviors we talk about today. There are other paths. So that's important to mention. It's also important to mention that statistically speaking, most people who experience potentially traumatic events, and I'll talk more about those in a minute, do not actually experience something like PTSD or significant anxiety and depression. So many people who experience these things demonstrate resilience or a capacity to go down like a different path. So I don't want to, again, leave you with those feelings that it's hopeless. And also for those who do experience a more negative outcome or reaction, resilience is possible. We just need to give it time and we need to provide support. So we're trying to expand the definition of trauma to keep it as hopeful as possible. Next slide, please. Okay, in a space in which we're discussing community engagement, I think it's really important to talk about the classroom as a community. And the communities that our students then also engage with, right? So there's layers of communities here. Recent advancements, as I was mentioning, and kind of the conceptualization of trauma, they help us understand the value of communities as protective for the individuals within them who experience trauma. So strong communities can support individuals. So we build up our communities, we give them skills, we give them trauma-informed approaches to increase the resilience of the individuals within our communities. So if we ensure that every community is equipped to support people who have experienced traumatic events, then we make resilience increasingly possible. And I have this quote here that up to 70% of adults have experienced events that may be traumatic. So for this reason, our systems, childcare, law enforcement, classrooms, are adopting trauma-informed strategies. And the idea is to equip all institutions to play a part in preventing the adversity, but also addressing the trauma and restoring well-being. So all of us play a role in that goal. Next slide, please. Okay. Trauma can stem from any of the major life events that are listed here, among many, many others, natural disasters, abuse, loss. And trauma can be due to a single event, one single event. It can be due to multiple events of the same type or multiple events of different types. Trauma can be chronic, meaning that something is enduring or occurring over a long period of time. The more potentially traumatic events, or PTEs, which is the official term for these events, that someone is exposed to, the more likely they are to develop mental health concerns. And as I mentioned before, we call them PTEs because not everyone who experiences an exposure develops negative effects or outcomes. Okay, next slide, please. And then you can hit the animation. So we're going to talk about what trauma looks like. Thank you. If you have only one takeaway from my portion of today, please know that trauma shows up as anything. Trauma has a really sneaky way of hiding itself behind manifestations that many of us, myself included, are likely to initially attribute to something else. So for example, if someone seems a friend or a coworker, seems to be avoiding certain places or activities, we may initially think like, well, you're boring, or you're lazy, why don't you want to join us? When in fact, they're specifically having a challenging time doing the things that remind them of their specific trauma that we just don't know about. Another common example is that it is typical for someone who's experienced trauma to have a difficult time focusing or paying attention. And so a lot of times people will attribute that to something like ADHD or a primary attention concern, whereas in reality, it's coming from a past experience with trauma. So this slide has some examples of ways that trauma can show up. I hope it gives you that sense that it can look like many different things. And if it doesn't, I have 2 additional slides to bring this point home. So Stephanie, you can go on to the next slide. So what does trauma look like? On the left, you see some common emotional and behavioral responses similar to the previous slide. And the impact of this slide is that trauma also looks like physical responses. We're talking about chronic pain, fatigue, headache. Not listed here, but very important, is that trauma can look like substance use or abuse. So when we say common reactions, we're literally talking about almost anything that you could come up with. Okay, and my third slide, what else does trauma look like? You can just click through a bunch of it. Thank you. Trauma can look like nothing that we can observe on the outside. It can look like normal everyday activities, interactions, and there can be an invisible internal struggle. So we don't know what's going on the inside. And I want to say that I added this slide because in my last training, a participant actually raised her hand to make sure that the entire audience understood this point. And I thought that it was so good. I said, I'm going to add a slide from now on. Trauma can look like this, right? Which is nothing we can see on the outside. And so that brings us to my next slide. And this is my iceberg analogy. So a trauma-informed approach to our students, to ourselves, to our coworkers, family members, really anyone else would start with humility. And what I mean by that is that we're humble in realizing what we know and what we don't know about the people around us, what we can see and what we can't see. So the iceberg helps us understand that what we see in a person, what we observe on the outside, is only a small fraction of the person's whole self and past and current experiences. So some of the student behaviors that Stephanie was talking about earlier, we see them, we grade them, we evaluate them based on those behaviors, and we have to stay humble that we don't know why some of these things are showing up. And they exist, right? Like that's the other piece. Not only do we not know what they are, but we have to recognize they exist. What we see is such a small fraction of a person. I've been using this slide and talking about this since the pandemic. I did a lot of talks about kind of child adjustment during the pandemic. And so I have an example that I love to use, which comes from my daughter when the pandemic hit and she was 9 years old. And she had a new bike, and we were so excited that we all had bikes so that we could actually take bike rides and utilize some of what was available to us during the early days of the pandemic. And so we were like, let's go on bike rides. And she was resistant. And my reaction, my initial thought was, well, she's lazy. She doesn't want to ride her bike. She doesn't want to be with her family. And that went on for a few days until I got a little bit more humble and thought outside, thought down deeper into the water there, had some conversations with her. And I learned that she, as a 9-year-old, was trying to understand COVID and was afraid of what would happen on a bike ride because it was confusing and complicated and she didn't know. And we were able to have a really good conversation about what we knew at that time and what was safe. And I dug a little bit down into the iceberg there to help sort of understand so that we could have a good conversation and change our behaviors a little bit. Okay, next slide, please. Watching the time, I know I have about 10 minutes. I'm going to move towards practical strategies for a trauma-informed classroom. And yep, thank you. So I've been using this, this phrase, trauma-informed approach. Frankly, to be honest, it's not my most favorite phrase. I think there probably someone could have developed something a little bit better, because what it means to is what it refers to is broadly approaching situations and people with thoughtfulness and care, that humility that I was discussing, so as to reduce the potential for re-traumatization. We can never completely create a space where we are always unlikely to re-traumatize someone because we don't know everything about their lives. We don't know what will activate someone, but we can work towards reducing that. Trauma-informed practices just means showing up as someone who understands that the many people around you have experienced negative life events or traumas, and that certain language, certain approaches, and certain practices can activate negative feelings related to someone's past negative experiences. That's kind of what we mean by a trauma-informed approach. The 4 R's of a trauma-informed approach, according to SAMHSA, are to realize, which we've sort of talked about, that trauma is widespread and it impacts people. To recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma and trauma responses, and we've sort of covered that in 10 minutes today. And the next 2 are what I'm going to talk about next, which is responding, and responding by applying trauma-informed principles and practice, and then resisting re-traumatization by being mindful of whatever practices you're using and just willing to make adjustments along the way. So my next slides, I think there's an animation here, Stephanie. Thank you. My next slides are going to focus on 3 strategies that are, or 3 specific trauma-informed practices regarding teaching and community engaged work that really focus on the response, the responding, and the resisting re-traumatization. So those last 2 categories. Okay. So the first one I'm going to talk about is offering choice. Choice, I have to admit, is sort of my go-to word when I'm trying to figure out what the best direction to take is in a specific, situation, or whether it be a classroom or a work situation. In a classroom, offering choice, and I know that my fellow presenters are going to kind of get at this a little bit more specifically, but offering choice allows students to demonstrate their knowledge and their skills in the ways that work best for them. I was so impressed with my daughter's 7th grade. I think it was our science teacher. And she came home and she said, well, I get to decide if I want to do a computer-based presentation, an oral presentation, a piece of artwork, or it was something. And I said, wow, that's great. Like, what are you going to choose? In what way can you shine? Right? So that means that they were giving them options to shine in the best way for them. Choice also provides opportunities for people to opt out of something that may be specifically and individually re-traumatizing. Again, we can never know what is going to impact everyone. So by offering choice, we let people make those decisions for themselves. When would you offer choice? Like whenever you can, but you can offer choice in methods of participation, right? A lot of people do participation points, but what are the kind of flexibility and the choice points around there for participation? In assignments, as I just mentioned, happened in my daughter's 7th grade, and in consuming content when feasible. So let me give you an example here. Right after the violent incident on February 13th on Michigan State campus, I had a faculty member, actually in psychology, contact me who was teaching a class on, like in the middle of teaching a class on death and dying. And she wanted to know, like, how do I proceed? Because the content here, like literally the content of the class is about this. And so sometimes the content is what the content is. And my next slide gets at this a little bit more. But if there are options to consume certain content, wonderful. If there aren't, then we'll talk about that on my next slide. So I understand that consuming content may or may not be something you could provide options on for certain classes. How do you do this? This just involves a lot of creativity. It involves us I know people are going to talk about this, but really stepping outside the box of how we typically kind of organize, structure classrooms and evaluation. I recommend asking, students and colleagues, and having these sorts of forums are just an amazing opportunity to get ideas and learn, unique and new strategies. Even when I've done these sorts of trainings, I've heard from faculty ideas that I never thought of that they were doing. And just experiment with it and see how it goes. Okay, next slide. So the next kind of trauma-informed approach is to provide predictability. Reducing surprises allows individuals, again, to make an informed choice and, show up if you can. And also, if you know it's going to be difficult for you, do what you need to do to take care of yourselves ahead of a possible re-traumatization. And so this could be with regard to potentially difficult content. This could be allowing predictability with regard to evaluations, which can be particularly stressful. So making sure there's enough opportunities for people to do what they need to do to perform best in terms of preparing for assignments, exams, quizzes. It may involve some changes in course structure. It also, I guess what I mean by this point is that if there are changes that need to be made in course structure, how do you communicate that in the most predictable way as possible along the way so that we're not doing these last minute changes? And how do you do this? You do an overview of the content early, because again, we can't possibly know everything that's going to traumatize, re-traumatize, or affect even each person. You provide clear and advanced assignment timelines, and also demonstrating, and we'll get at this, this is kind of this goes into my next slide, but having available on-campus resources for health and safety makes someone know, like, if they're struggling, I have a predictable way to get what I need. Go to the next slide. So my last trauma-informed, and there's more, but this was just, meant to be built into a 20-minute presentation. So the last of 3 take-homes for today is to build safety. Last and certainly not least. I actually had this first, but sort of that last but not least. Feeling safe increases cognitive capacity. And when you have more capacity, your ability to learn goes up. You feel safe, you feel calm, so you can take in new information. If you're not feeling safe and you're not feeling calm, then all of your alerts are up and on, and it's really challenging to learn something new because you're spending your cognitive energy evaluating your environment and to determine if there's a threat. Feeling safe builds community. When you feel safe, you feel as if you can open up and take that back from your community. And like I talked about at the beginning, a strong community builds resilience for others. So where do you do this? On the syllabus. Well, one of the offices that Stephanie introduced me as the Office for Resource and Support Coordination, we're working with the Provost's office to give MSU faculty some examples of what they could include on their syllabus for MSU's safety and security. Like, what are the upgrades? What are the options? How you can learn? Because if you learn that ahead of time, generally, and even specifically to your classroom, it helps you know, like, I'm safe here, or at least think about whether or not you're safe there. You can offer safety and discussion. This could be a whole other panel, right? How you offer kind of psychological safety, especially in difficult conversations, but it's something to think about. And then how do you feel safe in your physical space? And how do you do this? Providing on-campus resources for health and safety, what is available to the students, being available. This is a new line. I'm really excited about it. You don't have to be a therapist. You just have to know one. So that is the realize and refer kind of model that I think a lot of us talk about. again, you can be available to your students in that kind of open way as long as you have resources to provide them. You don't have to give them anything more than resources. In fact, that's all they're usually looking for because they want to take up their resources in their own time. And then lastly, I have some utilize helpful versus harmful responses. And I have a slide next for that, Stephanie. So you can see here what some harmful responses to students might be. Not that I think anyone who shows up to a presentation like this would ever do any of these, but just things to keep in mind or pass on to others. You know, things like questioning whether someone, are you sure? Do you have proof? Versus how can I support you? I believe you. Thank you for trusting me. So some take home responses. And then on my last slide, I have a series of resources. The first is a book centering equity in trauma-informed education that our TSTN at MSU often recommends. Second link is the Trauma Services and Training Network that Stephanie alluded to. Lots of good resources there. We use the University of Buffalo's Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care. They have a organizational change manual that is free to download, and we use that in the TSTN often. And then next are a couple of PDFs that may be helpful as you're thinking through some of this. So I think I did it.
Yay. I always feel like the virtual space, it's so hard to fully give applause, but feel free to give a reaction. Zoom's got lots of fun new ones, or however you wish to engage. Thank you, Natalie. That incredibly helpful. Really sets the context for what we're talking about today. And again, some very tangible takeaways for folks to consider using in their own spaces. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm just trying to check the chat as well. Like I said, if you have questions as we move through, do please feel free to put those in the chat so we don't forget about them. And we will move into this next section. Also, just a note here, it looks like I've gotten actually a couple of questions. So we are recording this session, and you will have access to that recording after as well. Okay, beautiful. Okay, thank you again, Natalie. Let me introduce our next speaker, Dr. Estrella Torres. She is with the Residential College in Arts and Humanities at Michigan State University. I have the pleasure of working with Estrella often throughout the course of the academic year, and I am continually impressed and awed, and she's probably annoyed that we call on her so often as an exemplar, but the work that she does in her classroom spaces and in community spaces is just, well, it's exemplary. That is why we use that term. So Estrella is here to talk you through some practices that she has used in her classroom around storytelling. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Estrella. And I can't see you on my screen, Estrella, so hopefully you are ready for me to turn it over to. There you are. Okay, I see.
Am I here?
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Hello, everybody. I just want to, again, thanks Stephanie and the organizing committee for inviting me. It's always a little intimidating to be amongst these great scholars and folks. So I'm really honored to share space with you all and learn so much. So I think this is, Stephanie did a really great job of lining me up after Natalie, because as you were saying things, Natalie, I was like, check, check, check. So hopefully, my work aligns well with some of the things you laid out. So I just want to give a heads up. So I'm faculty at Michigan State University. I am the residential college in the arts and humanities. And the reason it's important for me to sort of say this again is I'm in an undergraduate teaching college. And so one of the cornerstones of our college is community engagement. So I have been incredibly fortunate to have taught in that particular pathway for almost like 15 years. So what I'm going to share with you is a lot of my experiences, things that I've learned, lessons that I've learned the hard way through the 15 years, and hopefully you can take something from this. And you'll see, again, because I am in an arts humanities college, there's going to be there'll be some, quotes from different authors. There's going to be a lot of photos. I also want to say, before I came to MSU, I was a Montessori teacher. So I'm very much, all of my work is very much grounded in the Montessori method. So you'll see, I love the residential college because it's kind of like grown up Montessori school. It's like the next step. Just a little shout out for ARCA. So what you see here, this first slide is a mural, and I'll come back to it at the end, but I just kind of want you to take in this beautiful work by Dene Chicana muralist Nani Bachakon, who does community and site-specific murals. So this mural is a reflection of stories that she conducted with elders and youth in the Lansing area for 5 weeks, and then developed this beautiful mural as a reflection of those stories. So that kind of helps explain a little bit of some of the things that I'll be talking about next. All right. So Stephanie, I can't remember, am I advancing the slides? No, thanks.
I've gotcha.
Thank you. Okay, so to ground us, I want to share these words by Ojibwe author Louise Erdrich, who says, when we are young, the words are scattered all around us. As they assemble by experience, so also are we, sentence by sentence, until the story takes shape. And so the work that I'm going to share with you is a bit of this story that shapes and it is informed after every opportunity that I have to teach a course, and the lessons that I've learned through that. What I hope is at the end of my time, and I forgot to start my clock, sorry. So at the end of what I'm hoping is that at the end of my time with you is that you'll take sort of 3 things. One is storytelling as truth telling. To understand that the stories that are shared, they're based in people's truths. Storytelling as community building, and developing impactful spaces for sharing stories. And so the 3 photos you have at the bottom again are the different ways that storytelling takes place in my courses. One is through the active engagement of dialogue and sharing stories. One is through doing and sitting and practicing the stories that have been shared and putting those stories into practice. And the third is reflection, just sitting amongst others and sort of thinking and looking out and just kind of thinking about the stories that were shared and how those impact ourselves. So next slide. Okay. So storing practice is an action, grounding relationships. So I'd like to share, this is what I do for myself before I begin a course, before I begin to teach a course. These are 4 values that I hold that are important to my course. They helped ground me. They help me think through what I'm going to embark on with my community members, my learning community members throughout the semester. And they're good touch points for me throughout the semester. So the first value is reciprocity. And so I should also say, these are questions that I ask myself when I think through these values. The first is reciprocity. So how is the space set up for people to learn from and with one another? And that can look very different. Sometimes it literally means the physical space. How are the tables set up? How are the chairs set up? I know some folks really like the Socratic method, and some people really like sitting in a circle, and some people really like sitting in pods. It's important to think about that physical space and what that physical space invites, and think about how that physical space encourages storytelling. But then also think about, what does that space need to have in terms of being an inviting space, so that it's encouraging our learning community to learn from one another. So then the other thing I think about is how am I, as the instructor, establishing a collective learning community space? I love what Natalie said earlier. I do think about community. Each of my classes is a learning community. It's a community that that is inorganic and organically created. And once you start thinking about that space as a learning community, start thinking about kin relationships that are built, the sense of responsibility that's created once developing and being in community with one another. The next value I hold is respect. So I call to attention the power dynamics in the room. I'm not going to pretend that there aren't power dynamics. At the end of the semester, I know that I will hold the power in evaluating the students and grade them. And so to pretend that there aren't power dynamics is unfair. So how do I call attention to those power dynamics in the room? How can I be attentive to how those power dynamics shape and shift the space throughout the semester? And how can I be attentive to making sure that I do my best in trying to flatten the power hierarchy and give up and give space to others to step in to that power, that space of power? Which lends itself to the next question that I ask of myself. So what practices are necessary to ensure that all voices are heard and valued? And this is, I'm going to say, this is moving beyond classroom norms. I know developing class norms at the beginning of the semester has become common practice. But what I have also noticed and observed is that students seem to get into an autopilot mode. They reiterate, they kind of like parrot back what they think the faculty member, the instructor wants to hear in terms of class norms. We need to be respectful. We need to show up on time. We need to da-da-da. But what I'm asking of myself and what I ask of those in the learning community is to really dig deep into what that means. What does respect mean? And I'm really attentive to that for a number of reasons. One is I happen to have a guest speaker in one of my community engagement classes who does this incredible work in the local area about developing community gardens for trans and queer, farmers. I apologize. I don't know how to turn off the messaging, so I hope I thought I did it, but it's not coming up. But I apologize. So I had the speaker come in and we talked about developing, or I mentioned like, so this is a safe space in the class. And that speaker said, I think we need to stop and take a moment and really think about what does safe space mean? Safe space for you as a cisgendered woman, femme-presenting woman, it looks very different for somebody who is a trans woman. It looks very different for somebody who has a disability. It looks, as an able-bodied person, this looks very different. And so these are the types of things when I say making what practices are necessary to ensure that all voices are heard or valued, and moving beyond the class norms. I'm very attentive to digging into things like respect. What does respectful dialogue mean? What does that look like for that particular learning community? Because it may shift semester to semester. When students are like, oh, we create a safe space. Again, thinking about what does that mean? How do we create that? And you would be surprised how difficult how much time we have to spend in creating those norms once you start asking those specific questions. And it's a fair amount of reflection that has to take place. There was one semester, I'm just going to quickly share, there was one semester when I asked this question, and what came out of it was that we all had to sign a contract. And if at any point that there was an infraction, that we caused an infraction or we broke our contract as an individual, there was like a series of steps that had to be taken to be welcomed back into that learning community. And I had to sign the contract as well, which was kind of interesting to be ousted for the potential to be ousted of the learning community. But I really appreciated that because the class really had taken ownership of shaping in that particular learning space. And what it did was ensured in that practice alone, it ensured that all voices were heard. It uplifted the voices, and there was something like kind of tangible that came out of that. So the next value is responsibility. How are people encouraged to leverage their relative power to build together? So again, thinking about power dynamics. If I'm asking, if there's the potential of me asking students and myself or my learning community members to participate in storytelling and in storying, we are expecting a certain level of vulnerability to take place. And we're asking people to step into their power. But we're also asking people to be reflective of their position in relation to power through that process. And so how do we think through our different accesses to resources, to cultural capital, to power, and how do we layer those or leverage those so that we can build a collective story together through this process? The other part of that question I ask myself is involvement in the storying sustainable for all community members? There was something mentioned before that we are asking a lot of people to share their story, and we're asking them to dig in deep. And so at some points, they may not be prepared to dig into the places that we're asking of them. So how do you make that a sustainable place where people can actively, where those in the learning community can actively engage in ways that are most comfortable to them? And then the final value is relationships. So how am I, as the instructor, relating to the learning community? How am I stepping into that space? How am I joining that space? What am I willing to give up to be in that space? One of the things, like I always set up my classes, I say, whatever I ask of you, I ask of myself. So I'm not going to ask you to share a story that I won't put out on myself. And that level of vulnerability is very scary for a faculty member, to put yourself in that space where you are having to be very truthful and transparent. And it's actually off-putting sometimes to students. They're not accustomed to having their teachers, their educators, be that honest and transparent with them. And the last piece is, how are the students engaged in the process? And this is what, when I'm specifically talking about this point, I'm asking about how are they engaged and how are they able to shape the storytelling process? So what you'll see here, and I'll give you two examples. So what you see here are two different examples of storytelling. So at the bottom left, where it says the Green New Deal, Detroit Ecological Arts Leaders, this is an active practice of re-envisioning, restoring a narrative of Detroit. So we have a group of students from ARCA working with Detroit youth, reclaiming a story of their narrative or of their neighborhood that is not told by the youth, but is told by those outside, who've often framed their neighborhood in Detroit through a very deficit framework. So this is a way of these students working collectively, restoring their neighborhood. And then you'll see sort of on the, I think in the right upper corner, we had two pieces. We had like this tangible poster piece, and then we had this other piece where the students created this presentation and presented it in what we have here. We have a 360 room. So you walk in and the presentation is you walk into this entire poster, I guess. I don't know what's called, like a Canva presentation. And it's multimodal, and it tells the story. Again, it tells the story of Detroit from the perspective of the Detroit youth. And it was such an incredible moment to get here with these youth, because we had to sort of go through building respect, building trust, building relationships, going through understanding what reciprocity meant in those spaces, and then being responsible for one another. So I'm going to walk through a little bit more of this in just a minute. So Stephanie. So, okay. Again, these are, I'm giving you some points of things that I actually ask of myself and think about when developing a course or stepping into a course. These are also things that I share with my students after I've sort of reflected on them for myself. I ask these same things of my students. So these are some of the lessons I've learned over the years of working with community and bringing my students into community and doing community engagement. So the first is calling out. So modes of communication rewarded in the schooling system. And so I'm gonna bring attention to that because I myself, having Spanish as a heritage language, did not have the best experience in schools. I oftentimes struggled with some of the words that I was supposed to use in a classroom setting, let's just say. And for that reason, to this day, I struggle with public speaking. And so it's what I've learned through this working in community is that the students that I work with also have this very, this inner dialogue with themselves about the modes of communication not being correct. Right? I'm not going to say standard English because I don't really believe in a standard English. However, what I will say is these students struggle with not having the forms of language that reflect their home and their community as being acknowledged as valid and valued. When you're doing story work or storytelling and storying with your students, it's important to really consider that. If you're asking for your students to show up wholly and as themselves in those spaces, you have to acknowledge some of those things that they've internalized that have told them that the language that they're using is not sufficient. This really hit home with a project that I did with 4th through 6th graders called Nuestros Cuentos, and it was a storytelling project where I brought undergraduate students to work with these 4th through 6th graders who were primarily who came from primarily Spanish-speaking homes, to really have them tell the 4th through 6th graders or share their stories of what it is like to grow up in Michigan. It was difficult for the undergraduate students to not automatically want to write the stories down. I had to remind them that once you're asking these 4th through 6th grader, to put pen to paper, the story stopped being the story of the students and started being the story the students thought that we wanted to hear. Once we hit or overcome that barrier of miscommunication, what I saw was that the 4th through 6th graders were intermingling Spanish and English in ways that were realistic and authentic to their homes. We have to recognize the way that language shapes how we tell our stories and can sometimes filter the types of stories that we want to tell. That leads into the next. So in validating practices of home pedagogies, we have to call that out. Meaning, again, the communities that I come from, the communities that I work with are very accustomed to having their home pedagogies, the lessons that they've learned in their homes is not seen as valid, as not acknowledged as strengths. And so it's important to call that out and to really think about if we're asking students to share their stories with us, we're asking them to share their experiences, we have to acknowledge the importance and the strength that are based in those home stories, those home pedagogies that have shaped them. Tara Yoso has done this incredible project called, excuse me, Building on Mole's Cultural Capital. She's created a model called around community cultural wealth. And community cultural wealth is a strength-based model that acknowledges aspirational, familial, social, linguistic, resistant, and navigational forms of wealth, of community wealth. It's important to like uplift those things through the storytelling process to create space, to acknowledge that all of those different forms of community and cultural wealth shape your student or the students. The other thing to call out is the ways in which we distrust ourselves. Again, in distrusting ourselves, we're not allowing ourselves, we're not allowing others to show up as their full authentic selves in those spaces. If we're thinking about using storying and storytelling as a way to help support students, it's important for us first to begin with the trust and trust building and trust the ways in which we distrust one another, but the ways, and most importantly, that we distrust ourselves. To start thinking of storying and storytelling as a healing practice. The other things I want to uplift, The other thing I want to uplift is calling up. So voices are informed thought, voicing are informed thoughts with trust, respect, confidence, and love. I love this Indigenous framework from the First Peoples of Australia that ask us to practice deep listening and not hearing, to be present, to try to block out as much of the noise as possible and just be in that space. And the other thing that I lean deeply into is understanding and acknowledging our individual and collective gifts. To understand that the words and the experiences and the space that we're creating together through that story, the storying and storytelling is a gift. It's a gift that you're giving to yourself, and it's a gift that you're giving to the students, and it's a gift to those others in the learning community. And so I just want to share, these are two quotes from a student and then from a community member. The first is from Juan, who says, "We are taught to ignore each other. We learn to stop listening to each other, and then we eventually stop listening to ourselves." That was heartbreaking to read. It was a very heartbreaking thought, but a very profound one. And then the others from Bo, a 12-year-old community partner, who says, "They don't see us, they teach us to silence ourselves." Bo, this was such a powerful moment because it really showed the ways in which we've learned and internalized to distrust ourselves and just and to silence our stories and to erase our own stories. So next slide. So we aren't going to have time for this. I apologize for talking over, but I wanted to share an assignment that I've really found to be important, and this sort of speaks to something that Natalie said about choice. I have this assignment called a Sway. It's sort of like a Tumblr, but it's multimodal, and it allows students to upload text, videos, voice in response to a prompt. So for this particular assignment, what I have students do is as a group, we decide on a prompt, and then we decide on the ways in which we think that the modes that will best speak to that particular prompt. And sometimes we give a couple different ways in which they can, for those who are, I'm not an artist. So anytime we had like a student who's like, "Let's do a collage," I'm like, I'd much rather just write some stuff. But it does give that choice, and it allows people to dig in and tap into the ways in which they feel most comfortable And so I just, of course, I lean heavily on Bell Hooks, Black feminist, who has shaped my life as an academic, who says telling stories is one way we can begin the process of building community both inside and outside of the classroom. Stories help us to connect a world beyond self. In telling our stories, we make connections with other stories. And hopefully what you saw is through that's really what this is about. It's about, first, we must connect with ourselves. We must connect with ourselves and think through the noise and think through the ways in which we've been told that our stories are not important, through all the different mechanisms, and then find ways to sort of reshape our narrative and then share those narratives and share those stories with others so that we can find connections and help build one another up. Next slide. Oh, okay. So if I have like 2 minutes. So I wanted to again share this. So this is the mural by Naniba Chakon, Mawed Mijim, the one who provides. So why is this mural important? This mural is important because it is placed in a part of Lansing that was historically a community for the Latino community and Indigenous community, oftentimes erased from the narrative of the Lansing area. So you have this 3-story brown woman picking strawberries, which speaks to the strawberry feast, an important ceremony for Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi people, as well as can be reflected in farm workers, the farm worker community that helps uphold Michigan's economy. This mural was a reflection. It can be read in so many ways, but really what it does, it speaks to and speaks back to the erasure of these stories. And it happened because Naniba chose to engage in storytelling. This is one way in which just storytelling can be a powerful tool and change and make some significant changes in your community. And it's such a cool like icon in the Lansing area. And it's beautiful to see how many young brown children go up and just are so excited to see themselves reflected in a space that is often not. So thank you for your time. Miigwech. Gracias.
Thank you, Estrella. We'll do the same thing with our awkward Zoom applause. Thank you so much. As I said earlier, it is always a pleasure to work with Estrella and to see the amazing projects that she and her students are doing with the community. So thank you so much for that. And I want to point out that that link will be available in the slides when we send those out, so you can see the visual of the sway and all of the work that Estrella does with her students. So thank you, Estrella. Okay, all right, look, friends, we're good. And my place of the planet, it is 5:15. So like we're stretching a little bit. We're like getting our lives together. Feel free to do that if you need to as well. We are moving into our kind of final section here. So let me introduce our 2 speakers, and then I'm going to turn it over to them because they are definitely going to be much more informed on this than me. So for this next section, we have Dr. Carmine Parati with Providence College. I have had the joy of meeting and spending some time conversing with Carmine at various national conferences, and I'm just inspired by Carmine's work and all that stuff, so let me not gush too much. And then joining Carmine is Dr. Jesus Hernandez with Brown University. And Jesus and I have not had the chance to meet in person. In fact, I shouldn't even say this here. Today is the first day, but I'm thrilled to be here with Jesus as well. And these 2 fine folks are going to be talking about supporting student learning and well-being through ungrading. So I am going to turn it on over to you both. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Thanks everybody for showing up. Thanks, Stephanie, for inviting us. Thanks, Carmen, for wrangling me into talking about things when usually I'm also an introvert, so I don't want to talk about anything. We're going to talk a little bit about ungrading today. This is based on some practices that Carmen and I have used together and now separately because he left Brown University, sadly, and went to another institution. So he's using this where he is. We'll talk a little bit about the context of how this came about in our own practices, give you a very brief intro to what ungrading actually is. Carmen then will then walk us through some case studies, examples from what I've done, he's done, and now he does separately, and then give us some themes from student feedback. I'm really sad that we are the third presentation because the last two have been very visually pleasing, and I just realized that Carmen and I have a lot of like blocks of student dialogue, so please forgive us for no animation or like beautiful murals. And feel free to get up and do what you need to do to maintain your attention. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the limitations of ungrading that we see. Thanks, Stephanie. So I'm not sure if folks have seen this or not. So so the context is COVID. We're in a quote unquote post-COVID world right now, but ungrading really came about for me as a practice that I started employing during COVID. And there's some statistics. I'm not. This is a great panel, so I wasn't quite sure what was going to be covered in terms of like student health and well-being. So I just wanted to give us a resource for folks to look at to get a snapshot of like what actually college students are going through, and particularly during the period of COVID, what their experiences were of the world. And that context, they bring that into the classroom with them, just as we bring our own context into the classroom with ourselves as well. So this all comes about in the space that I think Estrella did beautifully well of talking about creating that learning community in that environment. Thanks, Stephanie. So as I said, this came about during COVID as a practice to be employed. This is a point I think collectively, like folks can reflect back to that point. Lots of people were talking about grading practices and assessment practices. There was a real concern for student well-being, some concern, I guess, for staff and faculty well-being, but maybe not so much in the public eye. So at this point, you had a lot of folks talking about grading on our own campus at Brown. There was the question was floated of whether or not to institute a universal pass for all students, and I know that other campuses in the United States were also considering that as well. And so people were thinking about grading policies in general, and on our campus specifically, and you'll get these slides so you can read all these links. Students were really concerned about the inequitable barriers that students were facing in COVID. So if I was at home and I was in a home that had 6 other people in it versus if I was at home and it was just me and my mom and I had an entire wing to myself to do my studying, that's a different context. So our students were really concerned about factoring that into decision making. Jesse Stommel has written a lot about ungrading, and I highly recommend him and his work. We'll show his book. He's one of like 3 folks that I will recommend it. We didn't have a resources slide, so I might add that in before they get sent out. But he talks here very briefly and succinctly about how grades reflect bias, not only on the instructor's part, but on students' parts, right? So even in the creation of assignments, there's bias that goes into that. They do disproportionate harm to marginalized students and teachers. They don't communicate coherently. They don't adequately measure what we value most about learning, and they contribute to a culture of competition in education and an over-reliance on extrinsic motivation, which short-circuits intrinsic motivations. It's a very succinct, I think, takedown of grades. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So I think a lot of folks who are teaching were thinking about what does it mean to grade students in this compromised context of COVID, right? What does it mean to grade a student who online who is, did not sign up originally for an online course, did not know that there was a pandemic that was going to be happening when they were taking this course. What is assessment? What is learning actually in this environment? And how do we best support students and ensure learning at the same time? Since then, I think a lot of those questions have left the sort of popular realm, and there's been a return to the normal. But I do think that we can still learn from that. Just because that context is gone doesn't mean that the questions that we had about grades and assessment practices have left us. Thanks, Stephanie. So here's a second author that we collectively, or Carmen and I both use a lot, Susan Blum. This is, so Jesse Stummel wrote some stuff that has now become a book. This is sort of first collected volume on grading. And I think there's 12 or 13 case studies in here that Susan Blum has brought together that are vastly different examples of what grading looks like for folks in different contexts. And so like, part of like what was going through my mind during COVID was like, yeah, why are we grading? Like, what are we actually trying to accomplish in grading? I don't know if this resonates for other folks, but you know, like you get a PhD, you become a sort of content expert in a particular area, and then you're sort of thrust into a classroom and said like, great, now use that expertise to some way teach other people how to gain expertise or maybe about that expertise. And there wasn't a lot of pedagogical or like instructional tutelage involved in getting that PhD, right? So I found that like throughout my teaching career, I've been reassessing a lot of the things that I just assumed are, you know, practices that we should be doing, like the way that my syllabus looks. I remember that like I inherited that really barren stark syllabus where it's just the title and like a blurb and then like a list of books and the percentages and that's it. And at some point, I remember someone pointing out to me that maybe you should rethink that. Maybe like you're not a stark or barren professor and your classroom space is not meant to be that at all. So why does your syllabus actually making it seem like it's going to be that experience? So similarly with grading, there was a question there about like what is actually trying to be accomplished. And I'll say I was a professor for a few years in liberal arts colleges teaching Latinx studies and mostly literature. And I didn't do any on grading at that point. I was very, you know, I think going from ethnic studies over to now community engaged scholarship, there is a crisis of legitimacy around both of those fields. So there was a very much sense of like, no, this is rigorous work and I have to like grade you on how close your reading was of this particular poem. But coming over to the community engagement space, I think there was more of a time for me to reflect on what is the educational project and what is the learning that we're trying to do in the context of students engaging with communities and recognizing all types of knowledge as valid. So then what's my role as an instructor? And I really started thinking about that and then came about to grading as well of like, yeah, why am I grading students on how well they can articulate what bell hooks says about the engaged classroom, rather than like asking the student themselves, what do you want to learn in this context? What's most helpful for you? And then let's come up with some way of talking about and marking your learning across a particular period of time. So Susan Blum has this like great book, and this is in the introduction where we think of grades as inevitable, but it's and natural, but it's not. It's a very recent phenomenon. They go through the history of this, and it's not. We don't have to keep it around. We don't want to keep it around. Thanks, Stephanie. So these are some other arguments from Jesse, again, about what we think grades are supposed to do, right? Grades we think are supposed to incentivize students to do things, but they're not really that good at doing that. And this is all, he says he's arguing this, but this is all backed up by other research from other folks in other places. They're not great markers of learning. They're not good feedback, right? Like oftentimes, I think you can relate to this where a student will skip past the very detailed notes that you gave them, the paragraph that you spent a long time at nighttime writing in reflection of their assignment in response to it, and just go to the number and be like, okay, great, thanks, bye, and not read actually what you wrote. So oftentimes they're not actually a good system for communicating feedback if that's what the grade is supposed to be doing in the first place, or if we think of that as something that's supposed to be doing in the first place. Thanks, Stephanie. I'm going to skip ahead. Yeah, so in the context of student well-being, I really appreciated Stephanie's framing around being intentional in community engaged learning and how that intentionality and how community engaged scholarship in general and learning in general can be the space where students find their engagement. And these are two different sources of what's happening in the post-COVID world of like students kind of being checked out or not being able to re-engage in the same way that they were or having different values. And for me, at least, I think there's an opportunity for intentional practices in the community engaged classroom to bring them back in. Thanks, Stephanie. So very quickly, because I want to get to Carmen's case studies, ungrading, it's very simple. You just don't put a grade on the document that you're giving back to folks. Typically, for me, there's no numbers involved. There's no numbers and there's no letter grades. There is the same amount of feedback that they would normally get. There's no universal way to do this though. And you'll see if you read through Bloom's collected volume, there's lots of different ways in which different folks have implemented this in their classes. The practices are also different based on classes. You know, if I'm teaching one course, it might be completely different than if I'm teaching a different course. If one course is a lecture course, how I ungrade in that context is different than if I'm in a small 7-person seminar where there's like different forms of feedback and assessment that's possible. Yeah, so this is varies based on the instructor, the class, the students who are in the classroom as well, right? Ungrading can also be in conversation with students, right? What assessment practices work best for the students. Some folks use that as well to structure the way in which they're going to give feedback throughout the year. I used to be an academic editor for a certain time too. So one of the first things that I would also ask folks who I was doing editing work with was like, what kind of feedback do you want? Do you want me to give you a long thing? Do you want me to line edit? How do you want to do that? I do the same thing with students often. Like, what's the best way to give you feedback for the purposes of like what you're going to try to accomplish in this course? It's not an all or nothing approach. Also, I don't want folks to walk away with this idea that like I have to never put a number or a letter on a assignment again. You can implement it for one particular assignment. You can implement it for a particular facet of the course, a particular, you know, like if they're doing a project, a group-based project, maybe that's not graded, but it's a sort of pass-fail type of thing. Yeah, and you don't have to do it every single semester. You know, course to course, it's a decision. And at the same time, it won't fix everything, right? This is one practice in a context that I also appreciated yesterday, pointing out the power dynamics of grading, the power dynamics that are present. Don't just start and stop with assessment and feedback. So this is just one thing that we can start questioning and start thinking through and being more deliberate and intentional about. Thank you. Oh, I also will just say that, you know, I'm talking about this in the context of teaching and courses, but it can also apply to co-curricular spaces as well, of like, how are we having students assess their engagement and how are we engaging the students around their assessment? Is it hours and what are the sort of metrics that we're using to talk to students about accomplishment in the space of community engagement? I also just want to say this is a shameless plug for Carmen and I's chapter in the anti-racist community engagement volume. So we talk about ungrading practices as anti-racist practices in the classroom as one thing that folks should think about when they're trying to create a classroom space that is focused on equity and anti-racism. Now I'm going to turn it over to Carmen.
Thanks, Jesus. And I'll just say that the first semester, Jesus, when I first started at Brown, Jesus mentioned ungrading to me, and I kind of laughed at him and just walked out of his office and went back to mine. And then eventually, through many conversations, he convinced me to try it in my classes at Brown, and now it is the only way in which I teach. So, well, grade and assess, I guess. So thanks, Jesus. But so yeah, I'm going to talk through a little bit of like what we do in the classroom and share some student feedback along the way. These are kind of a lot of text-heavy slides, so I'll move through them quickly, but you'll all get them as well. But as Jesus said, right, it's this ungrading we see as one strategy alongside several other practices that we employ to foster student learning and well-being. So that kind of the practices that we've talked about, particularly in the chapter that Jesus just showed. Sorry, my alarm is going off. So that you may keep hearing that, but my wife is home and we'll take care of that. 3 practices are developing student agency and leadership through individualized assessment, critical consciousness through self-reflection, and relational approaches to community engagement through one-on-one meetings. And I'm going to talk through these, and hopefully you'll see how they all intersect and build upon one another. Thanks, Stephanie, for advancing. So first, we're really explicit in naming our ungrading philosophy in our syllabi and discussing it in the classroom, including why we do it. So this is just kind of an example of some language we've included in our syllabi. We talk about how we situate the practice as part of our collaborative learning model, and invite students to actively participate in sharing what types of feedback best enable their learning. And students could share this type of information with us through regular self-assessments, as well as one-on-one meetings, which as I just mentioned, are kind of the two other practices that we're going to talk about. Next slide, please. So kind of through regular self-reflection at various points throughout the semester, including a goal-setting activity at the start of the semester, we invite students to self-assess the goals they set, their coursework, and learning alongside both our qualitative feedback as well as the peer feedback, and because we include peer feedback in many of our assignments. But because in most cases, we have to assign students a grade at the end of the semester, right? It's something that's often required of us, even if it's a pass-fail class, which we've done a couple times. We also invite students to grade themselves at the midpoint and the end of the semester to kind of further promote that student agency, that leadership that we've talked about. And the grading criteria is something that we share, that's in the syllabi, that we share and discuss with students along the way. Thanks, Stephanie, for advancing. So I'm just going to briefly go through kind of these 3 self-assessments, and there's just a couple questions on the next 3 slides, just to give you a hint of like what are we asking, specifically to the practice of ungrading. So we began, like I said, having students establish goals for the class and to kind of reflect on their learning style. And in this first reflection, we invite students to go to that description of our ungrading philosophy in the syllabi and to look through and think through what forms of feedback best enable their learning. So as Jesus just mentioned, sometimes it's I like in-text comments, sometimes it's I like audio or video feedback, or I want feedback on X. I do a lot of audio feedback in my classes. And we also encourage students at this kind of beginning point of the semester to meet with us one-on-one. Next slide, please. So at the midpoint of the semester, we again invite students to reflect on the goals that they set in that first assessment, and kind of their overall course performance thus far, including things they're doing well on, or things they want to improve on. And if they feel comfortable sharing any barriers that might be impacting them accomplishing their learning goals. In addition to assigning themselves a mid-semester grade, we also invite students to reflect on how we, as the instructors, could better support them and their learning during the second half of the semester, including if our feedback, for instance, on their assignments is beneficial. And this really gives us an opportunity to learn about us as instructors and get real-time feedback as well. And at this particular moment in the semester, we require one-on-one meetings. So we're not just assigning a mid-semester grade. Students are completing this reflection, then we meet with each student one-on-one, we discuss their reflection, we discuss their mid-semester grade before we submit it. We follow a very similar process at the end of the semester, where again, we ask students to reflect on their learning priorities and their overall course performance. They again have the opportunity to reassign themselves a grade if that has changed for them since the midpoint. And we ask students to reflect on their experience with ungrading, and that's some of the feedback we're going to share today. And at this point, we kind of encourage, again, an opportunity for a one-on-one meeting, but it's not required at the end of the semester. Before I get into some of the student feedback, thanks, Stephanie, I'll just, as I've said multiple times, we require at least one one-on-one per semester to discuss these self-assessments with students. I've done it where it was 2 or 3, and one kind of the midpoint is a really good point. Sometimes it gets a little crazy figuring out how to do that, particularly with larger classes. But we understand the focus of these one-on-ones to be not only to respond to student self-reflections, those self-assessments, but for us to better understand our students, for students to see us not only as instructors, but also people beyond the classroom, and to prepare students for their community engaged work. Again, text heavy, you'll have these slides. I'm gonna keep going just for the sake of time. So I'm gonna get into a little bit of the student feedback. So we have collected roughly 100 responses from students over a number of semesters across both institutions, so across Brown University and Providence College. And the responses have been overwhelmingly positive. And you can see here that roughly 35% of students mentioned ungrading as a practice that reduces stress and anxiety while simultaneously supporting and deepening course engagement and learning, in some cases in more meaningful ways than traditional grading practices. So I'm going to move into some qualitative data, if you will, and share some student feedback. And like I said, it was overwhelmingly positive. This is some excerpts from Brown University students who reflected on how ungrading, coupled with our thorough feedback on individual assignments, reduced stress and created a deeper engagement with course materials in a more active classroom environment. I'll just pause here for a couple seconds to give you an opportunity to read these. Just for the sake of time, I'm gonna keep going. Likewise, students at PC reflected very similar themes that we saw at Brown, but there was also this reflection from students about how ungrading allowed them to learn and grow from mistakes as opposed to being penalized for them. So for example, in most of my classes, not all, but most where I implement ungrading, it's typically a complete, some type of needs revisions or revise or resubmit, or incomplete an assignment. So students always have the opportunity to revise and resubmit an assignment if they so choose to, right? And there was also, as you could see in the last bullet here, there was also this mention from some students about how they thought that this practice of ungrading and the feedback, that the ways in which they were receiving feedback on their work mirrored or was more applicable to how they might be evaluated in the workforce. We have a couple student quotes from particularly STEM students, right? A field that is often more, we would associate with traditional grading practices. And initially, as you could see in these student quotes, students reflected that being a little bit apprehensive to ungrading, but later thought that the practice reduced stress and enhanced their learning, including, again, their ability to learn from mistakes. Just pause for a couple seconds there. All right, move on. Thanks, Stephanie. We just want to maybe overemphasize again that ungrading does not mean a lack of rigor, right? And in some in higher ed, we know might associate that with such. But what we learned from these student quotes, from these student experiences, from the data that we've been collecting over multiple semesters is that the lack of focus on grades, in fact, challenged students in different ways, and in some cases, as reflected in the student quotes, more ways than traditional grading practices. I head to the next slide. So we also want to acknowledge that, as one student shared, grades are how they've learned and been taught to measure academic success their entire life, that some students were, initially surprised or confused about the lack of focus on grades. One student said, quote, "I was a little confused as to how a college class wouldn't have grades," unquote, right? So worried about the lack of focus on grades. Some students said that they thought it might deter them from motivation or kind of their class engagement or how they showed up and impact their ability to receive an A, right? That's for many students the gold standard, what they're aiming for. So there was at times this hesitation, this concern, and sometimes even disappointment that there wasn't going to be a grade throughout each individual assignment. But in all of those cases, students simultaneously at the end of the semester acknowledged their appreciation for their practice, even if they didn't like it along the way. So the last thing I'll just note before I turn it back over to Jesus, who's going to share some of the limitations, is that despite those challenges, right, nonetheless, we see ungrading as in our associated strategies as allowing us to meet students where they are, to invite students to acknowledge themselves as active co-creators of their education and our collective classroom experience, which we've heard from across the presentations today, and to create this kind of open culture of intentional feedback that's multi-directional, right? And we see equipping students with these types of mindsets and skills teaches them not only how to approach themselves, but what we've really seen and what's reflected in some of the quotes, such as the one on the screen, but also teaches students to engage with each other, particularly in preparation for their community engaged work. So I'm going to turn it over to Jesus, who's going to share a little bit about the limitations of ungrading.
Very briefly, because I think we're at time. I think you can go through these quickly. So we just want to acknowledge that there are limitations to ungrading. Let's go back to that quote, please. There are some limitations to ungrading. One, it takes a lot of time. Sort of antithetical to the name ungrading is that like you actually spend a lot of time giving feedback. As Carmen says, you know, he's giving a lot of audio feedback, some video feedback. There's a lot of like intentional response, individuated response to individual students who are all on their own sort of learning journeys. The other context is that this is an interdisciplinary course that we teach. So you have scholars from all different areas, and all of them have different needs and wants out of the classroom experience. So giving feedback to each of those can take a lot of time. Not everybody has that much time. The last of these boot camps was about faculty and instructors and our well-being, right, as well. So I just want to acknowledge that our well-being in the space also matters, and that's something to take into account. It's time consuming, and it also requires adaptability and a shift in mindset, both on our part as instructors and on the students' parts as well, as we've seen through some of the quotes. And then also, if you can move to the next quote, Stephanie. It's also in the context of an institutional landscape as well. So as you can see from this student who's a student in one of Carmen's classes, while they were in line with it and Carmen was in line with it, they have an academic advisor who was also checking in on the student and was freaking out because like there was no grade up until a very certain point when they could finally say, oh, okay, great, you're doing good, you know. Thanks. Next slide. And there are two other ones. I think you can just, go through all of these. Right, so this also may not be applicable across all fields, right? We acknowledge that we're in a community engaged classroom. It's an interdisciplinary context. They're there to learn very particular things. It might not apply to some fields, but I do think, and Carmen would agree, in all fields, I think you can reassess what feedback is actually meant to do and how you're checking in with the student about it. And it can also, one other critique is that the lack of structure could be detrimental for some students. So again, I would go back to what Stephanie started us out with the intentionality that you bring to this has to be there, right? You can't just like start ungrading and not talk to students about what's going on and not check in with them. I think that's why we have the sort of laying the groundwork in the beginning of the semester, checking in the middle, and then reassessing at the end to constantly make sure that the student knows what's happening and is actively invested in their own learning. Those are all our slides. Thanks.
Big ol' applause. I feel like I let you all down on the slide advancement there just at the end. I made it the whole way through.
My fault. Too many transitions.
Nope, it was all me. I was doing so good. That was my bad. Thank you both so much. I think I always have so many questions about this particular topic area, and so I was so happy that you both were able to join us for this conversation today. And just the quote that you had in here about it kind of being, let me find it back here. It would be antithetical to the framework of community engaged work. I just really loved that connection. And what a phenomenal idea that thought came from the students, right? Like I was touched by that. So thank you for sharing that. I am trying to arrange my screen so I can see all of the little boxes of folks who are with us. I want to click us forward. We have a few minutes here left, and I know I can just feel it. There's got to be questions. I want to open up this space for you all to ask questions of our presenters today. They're also, what you're looking at on the screen right now, this is so selfishly motivated. I, as a learner, am somebody who needs a minute, and I need somebody to like help me move my processing forward because I'm usually so wrapped up in what everybody has said. So there are some questions here as well for you all, for those of you who have been listening and engaging. If you want to think about, what is one thing that you want to take away from this workshop? And that might help you also think about like, ooh, but how do I do that? And so let me ask some of these questions. How did this challenge your current understanding of supporting student mental health and wellness in your learning spaces, right? These questions can kind of help jumpstart perhaps this conversation. So going to open this space. You all are welcome to put up the little Zoom hand or just unmute or put your thoughts in the chat. And we are going to see what conversation comes from this. While you all are thinking, I'm also scanning back through the chat as I promised you I would to see if I missed any questions in the process. I hope Kathy doesn't mind me doing this. There is a question in the chat, Natalie, that might be of interest for you. Thank you for the helpful overview. I don't see systemic oppression as a source of trauma on the slide with the tree. Don't see this as the same thing as cultural, intergenerational, and historical sources on the slide. And so she is curious about that, if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. Systemic racism, discrimination is often conceptualized as trauma. And we actually see responses to racism and oppression that are very similar in nature to other traumas. So I agree with you.
Thank you. Other questions? I think that's the only one I saw in the chat. You all covered this all so beautifully. Maybe there are no questions. Questions about application to your settings? Yeah, I see a hand, IARSLCE.
Hi there. I'm really curious about, with the ungrading, you talked a little bit about peer feedback, and I'm really curious about like how students experience that exposure to peer critique and peer observation. I think, one of the things that many of us seem to sort of be observing is that students can be really afraid to speak in like group settings because they're afraid that what they say will somehow be misconstrued or triggering, and will sort of invite some kind of, response that makes them uncomfortable. So I guess I'm curious, like, how does the peer feedback piece of that work, and like how do students tend to experience it in this sort of moment where students are so hyper visible, and I think honestly often afraid to talk about challenging topics, especially those coming up in community engagement, for fear of getting something wrong, making a mistake, being called out by peers, being canceled, whatever it is.
Jesus, want me to start and you could add on? Yeah, so I would say by scaffolding, right? So one thing that Jesus and I have done, and this was really at his suggestion, was some of the smaller assignments that we require peer feedback. For example, I'm thinking of like 2 presentation assignments where students go out and they research a topic within our local neighborhoods and communities in Providence that relate to the community engagement work that they want to be involved in. Both of the classes that we've taught are mostly prep classes for community engagement. And in those particular assignments, we decided that like they're pretty low stakes assignments. Students don't need to present to the entire class. So we have students present in pods. We break them up by like topic area, and they present to each other. So rather than presenting to 18 people, they're presenting to 4 or 5 of their peers, and then they are giving peer feedback along to only those 4 or 5 other kind of students. The Sheridan Center for Teaching and Learning at Brown University has some great materials on like the difference between feedback and critique, and getting generous, like as we were talking about, like deep listening, in posing questions and making connections between what your peers are presenting about and what you're thinking about. So those are, we assign some of those very short readings and have students reflect on those. In some classes where we has worked really well, and this peer, I could see this students really appreciating this. I'm thinking about some of my classes at PC2 where it's a cohort of students who I've had for 2-3 classes now. It's a little bit more structured. So for larger group presentations, I've done things at students' suggestion of like creating a Word document, and for end of the semester presentations, there's a presenter, there's a peer reviewer in real time, and there's a note taker, right? So that someone is capturing the peer feedback from the presenter, and then there's kind of this like robust set of resource sharing that happens at the end of the semester that's on this living Google document. That has worked really well in, like I said, when it's more of a cohort base, when the students know each other, right? But those are some of the practices that have been successful.
Yeah, I would just add, like Estee was talking about, right, setting the context for like what does feedback look like, and Carmen mentioned our Teaching and Learning Center has great resources for students. So we set that context, like here's like what good feedback actually looks like, here's what negative feedback actually should not be. I'd also say like a part of it is peer feedback is a practice in the classroom of us trying to displace our authority as the professor as well. Because if they're constantly looking to us for the grade, right, they're no longer actually, we're trying to get them to not look at us for the grade. So bringing up student and peer-to-peer feedback as just as important as our feedback does some of that work. And I think it also helps the student prepare the student for engaging with community partners as well, so that they can see that everybody is an interlocutor in their community engagement journey. And like my opinion as a professor is not the most important. Their opinion of themselves is as important. Peers are going to give them feedback. Partners are going to give them feedback. Random people on the street are going to give them feedback. And their job is to just interpret all of that and move forward with the idea of what their goal is in this work.
Estrella?
I was just going to add, so I don't necessarily, I didn't know it's called ungrading, but I appreciate all of and I look forward to the reading through the resources. But one of the things I do in my community engagement courses is, in addition to the peer-to-peer, I actually, throughout the semester, have the students, have the groups share with their community partners. So the community partners can help course correct or to revise or to like touch base. And I found that that's been really helpful for the students, because it's removing me from the power dynamic, and it showed that they're actually more responsible to the community partner than to me. So it's not the grade that's driving the course, but it's their responsibility to the community partner and to each other that helps like shape that class. And so just wanted to share that.
I'm so happy you brought that up too, Estrella. I think the last little question here on this thought slide, right, is how can we, or how are we incorporating our community partners into this work around student mental health and wellness and support. Not to call out my colleague here who is here with me right now, but I'm going to anyways. Michelle, who is also in our center. We have this conversation often in the center around thinking about our community partners and working with our community partners as co-educators. And so we are on campus and we have access to all these resources, and we sometimes not very well, but sometimes well, are trained in pedagogical practices in classroom spaces, right? At the very least, we have these conversations happening around us. And so thinking around when our students are off campus with their community partner organizations, what types of supports are in place for our community partners to support the students, if that makes sense. So I appreciate you saying that, Estrella, in terms of pulling them and including them into that conversation. Other thoughts, questions, comments, responses to the questions on the slide? Michelle, I called you right out, so if you wanted to respond to that, you just let me know.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, it was funny because I was thinking about the community partner aspect of that, and was glad that you chimed in, Estrella, because I think that there's a big part of that when they bring, like Natalie talked about, their own community. There's layers of community here, and we're creating it in the classroom and doing that ungrading, but also then what happens, how are we preparing them to students to be in communities, and when they come from their own communities. So thank you for touching on that. I wonder, some of you talked about this a little bit, but like, how have your peers shown up to, are they asking you questions about this? what are you hearing from them? Are you hearing that, oh my goodness, you take so much time to put these things together and this is, really adding a lot. I could never do that. Or are they starting to kind of see what you all are doing and hearing your testimonials from participants and thinking, all right, this could be something that I could see myself doing, and maybe what advice you give to them? And I suppose that's for anyone who's excited to, chat a little bit more about this at the end of this session.
Well, I convinced Carmen immediately, so we did that. Did my work.
I did hear how well that went, but thankfully that was a few years ago. I mean, you've got lots of probably tools in your tool belt now.
I think outside of the community engagement sphere, there's been mixed reaction from other folks in other disciplines. I would say when I talk about this as a practice.
Yeah, I've had the question of like very similar to students who were like, why would a college classroom not have grades? I've had peers be like, so what do you do then? Like, and that's been at both institutions. I'm referencing our teaching and learning centers again. Like I've used, when I was at Brown, I reached out and I was like, do you know anyone else who does this? And I did that when I got to Providence College as well. And they've connected me with, in this case, the one or two other people who they heard have done this at both institutions. But that has been great to think about, because in our instance, ungrading isn't like one practice, as Jesus stressed, like hearing how other people implement it in their context, from a science course, at Brown, or a math course, I forget what it was, or, a humanities class at PC. So just hearing the different practices and the ways in which people do it. And in some cases, I think people would question what I do. Is it ungrading? Because across institutions, I've had to change practices. In some classes, I put percentage, like grade weights for individual assignments. In other classes, depending on the context, I don't. So it really changes based on the class and the topic. And that has confused like peers at time, being like, so you do grade? And I'm like, well, not really. But anyway, so yeah, I think some mixed reactions for sure.
Perfect. Let me just say that we are very quickly approaching 6 o'clock. Thank you all, and again, in my physical space, thank you all so much for hanging out with us this afternoon. One big thank you again to our speakers for spending this time with us and helping us all learn together. And thank you to IARSLCE for hosting this webinar series and kind of forefronting this content area. I want to just say 2 things. We have just started this conversation, right? So the topics covered today are just such a tiny little piece of this. And so if you are intrigued, you are challenged, you are interested, please, I encourage you to keep having these conversations and thinking about what this means in your space. And then the final piece I want to say too, I think everybody here has referenced the various resources available on their own campuses. And I strongly encourage you to spend time researching and making connections with the mental health and wellness resources available on your campus, as well as, centers for teaching and learning and those sorts of places, so that you hopefully know this already, but so that you know that you're not doing this work in a vacuum, right? So you are one of many that our students will be engaging with. And so encourage you to find those resources. we'll send you out slides. There will be a recording. There's links galore and contact information. So Godspeed to everyone here in these last few weeks. The beginning of the semester is always a wild and chaotic ride. And so I'm sending energy and love to you all. And thank you so much for being here today.